This session. Hopefully you've been enjoying the conference. I look forward to talking at this conference and missed it last year. Those of you who are here, you're either the bold souls who carefully read the schedule and saw this was a 90-minute session and came anyway, or you didn't read it carefully and you thought this was a regular hour-long session, but it's too late now. You're kind of committed. Not really. You could still leave. The reason for that is when Dr. Rapenchuk and I talked about this session, he asked me, he said, well, could you just do a survey of all of the history of Western thought? And that was a little bit of a daunting challenge that he gave me. And I said, I'd probably need a little extra time. So, of course, 90 minutes is plenty to do that. So as I was thinking about that, I was really trying to think, well, what kind of framework could I use, and what kind of resources might I find that would make that task of trying to zoom out to 30,000 feet and still remain coherent and still try and make sense of things, and then to make the presentation as accessible and applicable as possible. And so the lens that I decided to use was the thought of Plato and Aristotle, because Plato and Aristotle are obviously towering figures in the Western intellectual tradition, and their influence is still being felt even today. And they also, they came fairly early on in the tradition. And so that was, it gives us a way of sort of thinking about the tradition. And there's a great book by Arthur Herman called The Cave and the Light. And this is one of those big, sweeping intellectual histories. And anytime that you try and tell a story this big, you're obviously going to simplify things. But I think he does a pretty good job of avoiding this simplistic dichotomy between the Platonic worldview and the Aristotelian worldview, and still looking at the ways in which their ideas intersect with each other and continue to echo down. And so a lot of what I'm going to say today is based on ideas from his book. So in some ways, this is kind of like an extended book review. And so I would encourage you, if you haven't read this book, this is a really good one. I'll point to some other resources as well. And Herman starts his book with a famous image, which is Raphael's School of Athens. And I noticed as I was setting up that we were in Dr. Rapenchuk's classroom, and he has a reproduction right over there. And so here is one visual image that kind of captures this central position that Plato and Aristotle serve. And so we are going to use them and their thought as a way of just thinking about what are some of those dominant strands within the Western intellectual tradition. So Herman, as he is looking at this painting, he says, the School of Athens is in fact an allegorical painting about two contrasting but highly influential worldviews that have shaped our world in a perpetual struggle for the soul of Western civilization, a 24 centuries old battle between the ideas of Plato and Aristotle. And we will look at some of the figures who are represented here. Obviously, this image is from the early 16th century, so this is a Renaissance painting. And so it's a snapshot at a certain point in that tradition. We're going to carry our story beyond that into the 19th century. But already you can see here, Raphael looking back says, these are the two figures who are at the center of everything. Now, certainly this is not the only lens that you could use to make sense of the history of Western civilization. And I think it is important that we avoid an overly simplistic dichotomy between Plato and Aristotle. They have many things in common. I think particularly now as we are in a postmodern intellectual era, we look back almost nostalgically at the things that they shared with each other. And yet, they did have fundamentally different assumptions about things. And so the words that kept coming to mind as I was thinking about their contributions were that thanks to their input, there are these continuities. They ask the questions, they frame the debates that are going to continue to echo down. So there's this famous statement from Alfred North Whitehead, who says, Western philosophy is basically just footnotes to Plato. And I think Aristotle obviously is a key part of that as well. There's coherence, even within those debates, but there's also a lot of dynamism. So it's the interaction between their competing perspectives, their different way of framing things, that gives Western history, I think, a lot of that constant questioning. And what we're going to see is that in different periods, these two systems are in their ascendancy, or maybe they have been sort of overshadowed for the moment, but they're always there. And there's this oscillation back and forth as Aristotle's thought seems to be dominant, and then Plato's thought seems to be dominant as well. So obviously, before we talk about their subsequent influence, we have to think a little bit about, well, who were they? What were some of their key ideas? And so we'll start with Plato. Let me just ask you guys, where does Plato show up in your curriculum and in your courses? Where are your students going to encounter Plato and his ideas?
Philosophy.
Okay, yeah, philosophy. It's hard to tell the story of Western philosophy without Plato.
Logic.
Okay, logic. Yeah, absolutely. We're going to talk about logic. I think Plato is an interesting character, as we'll see, because his influence on the Christian intellectual tradition. Many people are more Platonist than they know because the early church drew so heavily on Plato's thinking to articulate the gospel and a Christian worldview to a Greco-Roman audience. So Plato, his influence is massive. I want to just talk really quickly about his epistemology, because he makes significant contributions there, his contributions to political science, and then also to metaphysics. And different aspects of the Platonic tradition are going to be more or less importance in different periods. So Plato is an idealist. When it comes to his epistemology, Plato is on the more rationalist end of the spectrum. Plato thinks that the world as we know it is a world of change and impermanence, but behind that, in fact, sort of underlying that, more fundamental than that, is the real world, the world of the forms, the world of the Platonic ideas. And his epistemology is going to inform a lot of Western thought, and we will see various manifestations of that. He is, in some ways, bringing together concepts from the pre-Socratics, and he is already trying to reconcile some of their insights. And so this is how Herman puts it. He says, reality for Plato turns out to have a dual nature. Yes, Socrates said the world is one of constant change and flux. As Heraclitus said, that's the visible world around us. In Socrates and Plato's terms, it is the world of becoming. But there is also a realm of permanence that Parmenides described, a higher reality that we grasp not through our senses, but through our reason alone. And this is the world of being, which is divine. And this is everywhere in Plato. Perhaps it's most famously represented in the parable of the cave. And he tells this story in the Republic about people who have spent their entire life locked down in the bottom of this cave, and all they see are shadows on the wall of the cave as those behind them carry objects back and forth. And then one day, one of the people in the cave manages to escape from the chains. He turns around, he sees the fire, he sees the objects, and then he makes this arduous journey out of the cave up to the real world. And of course, he is blinded by the sun. He's disoriented. But eventually, he adjusts and he sees things as they really are. He has entered the world of being and escaped from this world of transient forms. But he doesn't just escape. He feels this duty. He comes back down into the cave and he tries to tell other people there's more to life than these shadows. And as you know from this story, they don't believe him. They're like, you're a dreamer, or you're misleading us. And he, more than likely, is not just going to be disbelieved, but he's actually going to be killed. And this is a story about the philosopher who perceives through to the true nature of reality. It's obviously also a story about Socrates and his reception from the people of Athens. And it reflects this underlying epistemology at the heart of Plato's thinking. One of my favorite retellings of the story of the cave is actually in C.S. Lewis's Silver Chair, where the main characters go down and the witch is trying to persuade them that there is no world beyond the cave. And so obviously that image underlies that particular episode in the story. So we have Plato's epistemology, but Plato is interested in all sorts of other issues as well. And he makes fundamental contributions to political science. The Republic, I would say this is probably the book that we tend to default to when we're thinking about Plato, which is interesting because, as we'll see in the Middle Ages, this is not the book that they knew. And so the Timaeus, which is what they associated with Plato, very few people seem to read anymore. But the Republic is a foundational text for political science, but also for psychology and for education. And in his efforts to try and explain the nature of the well-ordered soul, that's where the conversation begins. What does it mean to be just? Why should someone be just? Socrates says, speaking for Plato, well, the soul is hard to see. What if we could find some macrocosm that we could study? So let's try and imagine, well, what is the well-ordered city? Because if we can figure out what the well-ordered city is, then we can figure out what the well-ordered soul is. And so Plato proceeds to describe this ideal city ruled by philosopher kings. And as we read that today, our reaction to that, I think, is probably ambiguous. It's in some ways a totalitarian state that he's describing, but it is his effort to try and figure out, well, what is the best form of the city. Later on, in the 16th century, Thomas More would write his own utopia. And of course, the Greek word utopia, it can mean both the best place, but it can also mean nowhere. And I think that's part of the legacy of Plato's Republic, which is, as an idealist, he's imagining the ideal city, and maybe the ideal city is unrealizable. Maybe we wouldn't like it if it were realized, but that vision is going to inspire lots of other things. And in fact, I would say, the perfect can definitely be the enemy of the good. Efforts to try and achieve perfection may actually lead us away from the practical, from actually, finding something that will work in the real world. And great evils have been perpetuated in the name of achieving a utopian vision. Think about a lot of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. On the other hand, I think all great reformers are Platonists to a certain extent. They refuse to accept the status quo, and they judge their society not in pragmatic terms, but they say, what should things be like? And that's part of Plato's legacy as well. So we have his political thought. We'll see that is going to inspire lots of people going forward. And then we also have his metaphysics. And if you look at, and I'll actually go back for a second to this image, both Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right are holding books. Aristotle is holding his Nicomachean Ethics, and Plato is holding not the Republic, which is what I think we might expect, but he is holding the Timaeus, which is his more metaphysical account of creation. And in the Middle Ages, this is the book that people most associated with Plato and his legacy. And so in this book, he speculates about the creation of the world, which he imagines as a very ordered, rational system created by a rational creator who is pure spirit, pure mind. And it is his confidence in the rational order of the world that gives him confidence that we can know something about the Platonic forms, despite the fact that we are finite creatures. He even uses the Greek word Genesis in this treatise, which is the title that is going to be used for the first book of Moses in the Septuagint. And so kind of interesting intersections. And as medieval Christians read this book, a lot of it really resonated with their sense of a world created by a rational being. And so Plato's contributions in all of these fields are monumental, and we're going to see that his legacy is going to extend down through the remaining 24 centuries. So we've got Plato. He is the first of our cast of characters. And then we have Aristotle. So Aristotle was a student at Plato's school, and as long as his teacher was alive, he followed in that tradition. But after Plato's death, Aristotle, perhaps as all of the most brilliant students do, begins to question some of the assumptions of his teacher. And Aristotle is ultimately going to break away, and he is going to come to some very different conclusions around some of these fundamental questions and issues that Plato had posed. So where in your curriculum and where in your courses are students likely to encounter Aristotle?
Rhetoric.
Okay, rhetoric. Right. His contributions to rhetoric. Drama. Yeah, his poetics. Logic. I mean, really encyclopedic. When I'm talking about Aristotle in my Western Civ classes to my college students, I say it would be sort of like if you went to a big university, an institution bigger than College of the Ozarks with more departments, and you were to discover that the same person was the department chair in physics and biology and chemistry, but also in political science and philosophy and theater, because he made such fundamental contributions in each of those areas. So Aristotle is an empiricist. So Plato, as an idealist, says it is those timeless ideas which are really the key. And Aristotle says, no, we learn through experience. We have to carefully observe the world. And he believed that knowledge is derived from experience. This made him much more interested in kind of the nitty-gritty of the world around him. And he would make contributions in all of these same fields that Plato did. And so he is interested in epistemology. Now, he's not opposed to reason, and in fact, he makes really significant contributions to logic. We're going to see that in the Middle Ages, it is Aristotle's logic that undergirds scholasticism. But I like what Herman says about Aristotle. He says, reason steps in after, not before experience. It sorts our observations into meaningful patterns and arrives at a knowledge as certain as anything in Plato's forms. Aristotle's term for this knowledge of the world was episteme. So this is where our very concept of epistemology comes from, which later Latin commentators translated as scientia, and we today have our word science. So this is the foundation of the empirical sciences. And he would not just speculate. He's not just a philosopher of science, a natural philosopher, as they might have said in the Middle Ages, but he is a practitioner of this. So he's going to pioneer fields like biology, zoology. He named 170 different species of birds. He named 169 species of fish. He named 66 different types of mammals, 60 different types of insects. So entomology, and so he's interested in those things, in physics and astronomy. Now, I think one of the real ironies of Aristotle is that he is the father of science in a sense, certainly an advocate of of empiricism, and yet he is going to become such an authority that in the Middle Ages, what he says is taken on authority rather than experimentally verified, I think, which probably would have been horrifying to him. And so one of the things we're going to see when we get to the scientific revolution is that the great irony is the scientific thinkers of the 16th and 17th centuries don't like Aristotle. But it's because they associate him with medieval scholasticism rather than when the actual empiricism that Aristotle himself advocated for. So he is going to advocate for careful observation of the natural world, but he is also going to make significant contributions to logic and the syllogism and that kind of careful thinking. And so I think Herman is right. What you get with Aristotle is careful observation processed by means of reason to try and derive knowledge about the world. And I think he recognized in a way that Plato did not, that a lot of knowledge is not going to be absolutely certain, but that there's still a lot of value in the knowledge that experience can give us. He was also interested in political thought. He was living in a tumultuous period in Greek history as the Greek city-states lost their independence to Macedonia, and Alexander the Great came and begins to conquer the world and spread Greek ideas all around. He wrote a book called Politics, and he famously says, man is a political animal. And even more than that, what he actually says is, man is a polis animal. Aristotle thought we are not individuals in the sense that we don't thrive best on our own, but he says we also don't thrive in vast sort of authoritarian regimes like that of Persia. The best scenario is small, self-governing city-states. That's kind of his ideal. And in the Politics, he doesn't just speculate about what is the ideal form of government, what is the perfect city going to look like. Instead, he actually surveys dozens of actual states. He looks at their constitutions, and then he evaluates the strengths and weaknesses of different systems to try and determine how does an actually functioning society work. He is interested in underlying issues, so he definitely wants to determine what is the telos of the community, what is the purpose for which the community exists, but he's always going to ground that in the actual day-to-day functioning of the state. And so this is the way that Herman summarizes it. He says, Aristotle concludes that community exists to serve the individuals who make it up, not the other way around. Plato's Republic celebrates a communitarian ideal based on men's dreams. It will give us Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Karl Marx, but also Martin Luther King. Aristotle's Politics, by contrast, will give us Thomas Aquinas and Thomas Jefferson, as well as Boss Tweed. It marks the birth of a democratic individualism that draws its pragmatic principles from sometimes hard-won experience. Now, I think we obviously have to qualify that because even though we describe ancient Athens as the birthplace of democracy, by our standards, it was not a particularly democratic place. And Aristotle is perfectly happy with the institution of slavery. He is perfectly happy with giving women very limited rights in this system. And yet I think his pragmatism provides a groundwork for continually revising these systems, which is something you could say about the American institutions as well. So Aristotle, interested in epistemology, interested in political science. Aristotle also, though, is interested in metaphysics. And he's going to make significant contributions to metaphysics as well. Aristotle is not all about abstract ideas that exist out there in the ether. He thinks the world is actually made up of combinations of matter and form. Right? So form comes in and matter is the raw material of that. And so this allows him to think about, well, the actual material world as we understand it, and there's reality to that, and then the forms give that meaning. He also distinguishes in his scientific writings between different types of causation. And so he's going to talk about the material cause of things, the efficient cause of things, the formal cause of things, and the final cause of things. In some ways, this is very different than what modern science does. Modern science is very interested in material causation. It's very interested in efficient causation, but final causation now sort of largely excluded from the questions that scientists ask. In that sense, I think Aristotle has a richer, fuller understanding of these issues. And we're going to see that Aristotle's metaphysics is going to inspire and undergird a lot of later medieval thinking, even something as fundamental as the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation is built on Aristotle's categories. So we have Plato, we have Aristotle, and we're going to now watch as their competing perspectives, their different answers to these questions sort of ripple down through subsequent ages of Western intellectual thought. Before we move on from here, any questions or thoughts just about Aristotle and Plato?
What relationship do you think the Latin word for like cogito for thought would have in relationship to Aristotle's use of episteme, as opposed to like scientia?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure exactly how I would kind of get into the weeds there, but yeah, that's a really good question. Andrew?
This might be something you're wanting to cover in a few minutes when you talk about their reception, but so Plato, the Timaeus, talks about this kind of mythic story of like a demiurge crafting like matter by looking at the forms. How was that read in the medieval period? Was he actually read as saying there was a temporal kind of beginning and crafting, or was that read as this mythic story in the medieval period?
I mean, I think for them, they read it through the lens of the Genesis narrative. So I think they probably attribute things to him that he didn't intend. But I think it certainly creates a bridge between the Hebraic mindset and the Greco-Roman mindset. Both Plato and Aristotle, there are elements that are problematic. So for Aristotle, the world is timeless. The individual soul may not be eternal. And so I think in both cases, they struggle to reconcile some of those issues. But yeah, I mean, I think that they would have seen, in fact, there are kind of debates about this in the early church fathers. Is Plato's insight a product of human reason, or is it a form of revelation, sort of inadequate revelation compared to the Old Testament? But I think many people are happy to see it as a form of revelation. Okay, well, what I want to do now is sort of move forward and look at various periods where one of these systems, the Platonic system or the Aristotelian system, is sort of in the ascendancy. And I don't want to overstate this because Plato and Aristotle's ideas are always there, but at different periods, one of them seems to loom larger. And I think there are interesting historical reasons for that, even textual reasons for that. So the first period I want to talk about is early Christianity. And in the early Christian period, Plato, I think, is the key figure here. Now, it's worth saying that obviously Christianity emerges from within first century Judaism. And so when you look at the New Testament and you think about the writers of the New Testament, Plato is not a dominant part of what they are up to. And they portray Jesus as the Messiah prophesied in the Hebrew Scriptures. But very early on, Christianity begins to intersect with the broader Greco-Roman world and the intellectual currents that are there. And so already in the book of Acts, you have Paul who preaches in Athens. And it's a really interesting story because in some ways it is perhaps Paul's least successful sermon. And he's doing fine because the people of Athens are always interested in novel ideas. And we know Luke tells us that there are Stoics and Epicureans there in the audience. And then he talks about the resurrection of the dead. And he basically loses his audience there because that was beyond their conception of things. Actually, it offended their Platonic assumptions, as we'll see in just a second. Tertullian, a century later, is going to ask this rhetorical question, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? And his answer is very little. So for Tertullian, Plato and Aristotle are both potentially dangerous. But the reality is that early Christian thinkers saw immense value in the writings of Plato, and that they saw truths there. And so whether it is Clement of Alexandria or Origen or Augustine later on, they're going to say, we need to be engaging with this. All truth is God's truth. And Augustine likes to talk about the pillaging of the Egyptians. So on our way out, let's carry away all of the value that we see here. And so the early apologists and then later Christian theologians are going to draw heavily on Plato. Herman puts it this way. He says, Plato was crucial. His works provided a framework for making Christianity intellectually respectable, while Christianity in turn gave Plato's philosophy a shining new relevance. The supreme light of truth that had hovered outside Plato's shadowy cave was now revealed to be the light of Christ. So obviously that is a sort of a syncretism that is potentially problematic, but I think there's a lot of value there. One of the keynote speakers at this conference, I think it was 2 years ago, was Louis Marcos. But he has a brand new book that's out in the last year, which is called From Plato to Christ. And he does a really good job of surveying the ways in which Plato's ideas are incorporated into the writings of the early church and then actually on down through history. So there are definitely some potential negative implications here. I would argue that Plato's ideas become so absorbed into Christianity that it, for many people, sort of changes some of their basic assumptions. And so if you think about the idea of the soul as needing to escape from the body, that's a more Platonic idea, as opposed to the early Christian emphasis on the future bodily resurrection. This is the very issue that Paul found he was unable to bridge that gap in Athens. And even in Orthodox Christianity, I think the asceticism, the emphasis that you see on virginity in a lot of the early church fathers, some of that is grounded in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, but I think a lot of it is actually a legacy of Greek assumptions that in a Platonic way elevate the intellectual, the spiritual, and denigrate the physical. And so that can take as extreme a form as Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is a fascinating intellectual movement because there are pagan Gnostics, there are Christian Gnostics, there are Jewish Gnostics, but Gnosticism takes this Platonic distinction between the physical world and the spiritual world and builds an entire doctrine of salvation around escaping, and around salvation consists in this secret knowledge rather than in the redemption of the physical world. So that's, I think, one of the potential downsides of Plato's looming influence, but there were a lot of positive things that came out of this engagement with Plato as well. And so if you think about someone like Augustine, now Augustine, I would say, he is a Neoplatonist at heart. He is not necessarily engaging directly with Plato so much as he is engaging with Neoplatonic interpretations. But Neoplatonism serves as an essential stepping stone in Augustine's journey back to Christianity. So when you read the Confessions, he goes on this intellectual quest, and he tries out all kinds of different things, including sectarianism, the different philosophies of the day. And he says this, he says, by reading these books of the Platonists, I had been prompted to look for truth as something incorporeal, and I caught sight of your invisible nature as it is known through your creatures. And so suddenly he finds a way back. Christianity becomes intellectually defensible to him when seen through a Platonic lens. On Christian doctrine, he says this. He says, if those who are called philosophers, especially the Platonists, have said things which are true and are well accommodated to our faith, they should not be feared. Which is a very different perspective than Tertullian's. And so he is going to use Plato, and when you dig into him, I actually think there are a lot of things where Augustine does take issue with Plato's ideas, because he's a very sophisticated thinker. But when you look at his understanding of knowledge as divine illumination, I think there's a Platonic epistemology that's there. And even in the city of God, this is how Herman puts it. He says, Augustine's city of God is a kind of Platonic ideal of which Christendom can become an earthly reflection only if it strictly follows God's word and laws. It's not just that, but I think this idea that there is some Platonic form of the church, which is different from the flawed institution of which, he's a bishop. He knows all the dirty laundry, but he doesn't lose his belief in that underlying reality, which is the city of God that is always there in the background. So Plato, very significant in his intellectual journey. Now, as we watch the ancient Roman Empire collapse, a lot of that ancient knowledge is lost during the barbarian invasions, and it is interesting. I mean, we have all of these writings of antiquity, but we know that there's a lot that hasn't survived. So we know that Aristotle actually wrote dialogues. Right? Wouldn't it be awesome if we could read those? What we have of Aristotle may be just like lecture notes from his students. And I always think, what a frightening prospect if all we had was what made it into the student's notebook. But Aristotle is going to experience this resurgence. I think part of this is attributable to the work of one man, Boethius. So in the early 6th century, Boethius is a Roman scholar. This is in the time of the Ostrogoths. The Roman Empire has collapsed. And Boethius, today he's best known as the author of the Consolation of Philosophy. And the Consolation of Philosophy is sometimes seen as sort of the last great work of antiquity, sort of a transitional moment. Boethius was probably the last Western thinker who actually knew all of Plato's dialogues. So he is a lover of Plato, but he makes it his intellectual project, his ambition, to translate all of Aristotle's writings from Greek into Latin. He can see the intellectual deterioration all around him, and so he says, I want to translate as much of Aristotle as I can, preserve that. Now, unfortunately, for the Middle Ages, he is only going to translate a few of Aristotle's logical writings before he will be accused by Theodoric of espionage, and then he will be arrested. It's just enough time to write Consolation of Philosophy before he is clubbed to death. And so in the Middle Ages, Aristotle is going to be highly respected, but for several centuries, people are largely just going to know him through his logical writings rather than the ethics or the politics. But even that little glimmer of Aristotle is going to have profound consequences. And so Aristotle's Organon, his logical writings, Herman puts it this way. He says, they showed or seemed to show that by linking one valid syllogism to another regarding a single subject, such as biology or ethics, or even the nature of God, one could build a conceptual chain of reasoning that would inevitably lead, link by link, from one set of necessary truths to another, all the way to the highest truths of all. And so for many centuries, Aristotle is not going to be remembered as the empiricist. He's not going to be remembered as the scientific pioneer. It is going to be his logical deduction that's going to be at the heart of things. And Boethius preserves that. Now, if we jump forward into the Middle Ages, in the 12th century, we have what is sometimes called the 12th century Renaissance. Medieval society had reached a point of stability and prosperity where it could devote resources to the life of the mind. And this is the era when famous teachers are traveling around to the various cathedral schools. The universities are about to be founded. And one of the most innovative thinkers of that era is Peter Abelard. I like to think of Abelard as sort of the Socrates of the Middle Ages. He asks questions, and like Socrates, it gets him into pretty serious trouble. But Abelard is fascinated by the power of logic. And so he is going to apply Aristotle's logic, and he is going to develop what will become known as the dialectical method. And this is going to be the basis for medieval scholasticism. And he is going to, many scholars actually think that it's Abelard who coins or at least popularizes the word theology, which is interesting if you think about it, because we would say, well, the church has obviously been doing theology forever, but if you look at the roots of that, theology is logic, the logic of God, right? So let's think systematically. This is nothing new. Obviously, Augustine had done this, and already in Abelard's day, Anselm had come up with the ontological argument. But Abelard is going to say, let's be really rigorous in our thinking. And so Herman says, Abelard tended to overstate the value of Aristotelian logic and of deduction as the only path to truth. Abelard had no interest in the one sphere where inductive reasoning is most important to yielding new knowledge, namely science. Aristotle's writings on that subject were still unavailable to him. Reason for Abelard and his followers was a tool for understanding what was already known, especially about God and the Bible. And so what the scholastics do is they take things that are known by authority, and then they apply rigorous logic and see what must follow from that. Now, in the same period, 12th century, an important development takes place, which is Aristotle's writings, which had been largely forgotten in the West, beside his logic, are suddenly rediscovered. And this helps to explain a really interesting little detail in Raphael's School of Athens, which is you have all of these Greek and Roman thinkers, and then there on the left, you have a guy in a turban, and that is the Muslim scholar Averroes, because in the Muslim world, the writings of Aristotle had been preserved, and Muslim scholars are reading and commenting on Aristotle's full corpus. And in the 11th, 12th centuries, some of those texts are going to begin to make their way back into the West. And so the earliest translations of Aristotle are not going to be directly from the Greek. They're actually going to be from Arabic. And they're going to be produced in places like Spain, in Sicily, where Christians and Muslims are interacting. And people are going in the West to read Augustine, or to read Aristotle through the lens of these Muslim commentators. Averroes, is going to call Aristotle the philosopher, which is language that Aquinas is going to pick up on as well. And so other books by Aristotle are reintroduced. This is going to create kind of an intellectual ferment. It's going to power a lot of the dynamism at the early universities, and it's going to bring back in the more scientific side of Aristotle's legacies. Now, Thomas Aquinas, I think, although he is interested in some of these questions of natural philosophy, Aquinas is building on the scholastic and dialectical foundation that had been laid by Abelard. And when you look at Aquinas's works, sort of his life project is trying to reconcile Aristotle's ideas with biblical revelation. And I think what was really kind of shocking in the 13th century is here are the writings of Aristotle, which are not just non-Christian, but they are actually pre-Christian. And despite that fact, Aristotle has provided a coherent worldview. So I think up to this point, it was hard for them to imagine a worldview apart from Christianity. And so the reaction to that is kind of multifaceted. Some more conservative people, like Bonaventure, they're going to kind of cherry pick from Aristotle, maybe to illustrate a point, but they're going to say, like Tertullian, this seems a little bit dangerous. There are going to be some people on the other end of the spectrum who are going to say, maybe reason and logic are sufficient. But Aquinas is going to say, I think we have to find a way of reconciling these, figuring out how these two pieces fit together. And Aquinas does a brilliant job of this. I mean, Aquinas basically is going to say that there are two different legitimate sources of knowledge. There is revelation embodied in Scripture, but there is also reason and experience, and that those two are not at odds with each other. In fact, they are mutually reinforcing. And I think the most interesting thing that he says is, so there are some things that we know only by means of revelation. So that could be things like God's triune nature. There are things that we will only learn through experience. I mean, a lot of what we know about the workings of the physical world, we learn through experience. And then there's this fascinating area where those two sources of knowledge overlap with each other, where we can know things by means of revelation, and yet we can verify those things by means of experience and reason. And he thinks that Aristotle has taken us about as far as reason and experience can go. He doesn't agree with everything he finds there, but like Augustine had done with Plato, he says there's an awful lot of value here. And so he is going to bring those two traditions together. And Herman says this, he says, the Augustinian and Neoplatonist mind passively contemplate the world and waits for a connection to a higher truth to be revealed. I don't think that's fully fair to the Augustinian mind, but Aquinas saw the mind, as Aristotle did, as actively analyzing that world in order to forge those connections for itself. And so our very capacity to understand the world around us, but even our capacity to understand the meaning of revelation, is a product of our capacity to reason and to apply our experience. Aristotle's influence is going to go even further than that, though. And so I do want to mention a couple of other medieval thinkers who draw heavily on Aristotle. Roger Bacon, who is an English writer, also in the 13th century. Bacon, I think, is going to be sort of a minority in this period, in that he is really going to focus in on the scientific legacy of Aristotle. And Bacon is going to make contributions to astronomy, to geography, to optics, to mathematics, to geometry. Herman says, more than any other previous medieval thinker, Bacon grasped the empirical aspect of Aristotle's thought, that knowledge ultimately comes to the knower via the senses, which supply the raw data that reason sorts and disentangles in order to arrive at the truth. I think what's interesting is you can draw a direct line from Bacon to subsequent English empiricists. And so you've got Francis Bacon in the 17th century, John Locke after that, and all of that sort of building on this Aristotelian empiricism. a little bit later in the 13th century and on to the 14th century, the medieval church is experiencing a series of crises like the Avignon papacy and the papal schism. And in that moment of uncertainty, writers like William of Ockham and Marsilius of Padua are going to rediscover Aristotle's politics. And you have this movement in the 14th and 15th centuries of conciliarism that is going to argue that ultimate authority in the church does not lie with the papacy, as had been the assumption for centuries, but that in fact church councils ought to be guiding the church. And conciliarism, there are theological justifications for that, but it is also grounded in Aristotle's politics. And so Herman says this, he says, for the first time, Europeans had a clear notion of a body of representatives chosen to act for the entire community, including the power to depose a ruler and replace him with another. For a few crucial years, a weak and divided Catholic Church came very close to being rebuilt along the principles of Aristotle's politics, thanks to Occam and his disciples. So Aristotle's, bits and pieces of Aristotle's legacy sort of flowing out in different spheres of medieval life. Now, as we move into the early modern period, this is a period of dramatic transformations in European society. This is going to be the era of the Renaissance, of the Reformation, of the scientific revolution. And here we begin to see Plato's influence rising once again. I think some of this is actually just a reaction to medieval scholasticism. And so the thinkers of the Renaissance and the Reformation, the scientific revolution, they see what had become sort of the staleness of medieval scholastic thought, and they associate that with Aristotle. And Plato provides an alternative. It also is, I think, in part a reaction to or a byproduct of the fact that in 1453, the city of Constantinople fell to the Turks, and Greek scholars flee into Italy, and they bring with them more knowledge of the Greek language. They bring with them more Platonic texts, and that is going to help to cultivate some of these developments. So in the Renaissance, when you look at Florence, which is kind of the epicenter of the Italian Renaissance in the 15th and 16th centuries, there you actually have the creation of a Platonic academy, which is sponsored by the Medici family. And they are going to elevate Plato as the great mind. Leonardo da Vinci, the great painter, in his treatise on painting, he says, "Let no one ignorant of mathematics enter here," which I think is a direct echo of the phrase that had been above the door to Plato's Academy, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." This is also the context in which Raphael is going to paint the School of Athens. And obviously Raphael appreciates both of these traditions, but Plato looms large there. The Reformation also has a Platonic element to it. I think for the Reformation, it's really not so much a celebration of Plato as it is a rejection of Aristotle. And before 1517, before he posts the 95 Theses, Luther, who is a good son of the church, is already writing against medieval scholastic theology. He's already rejecting Aristotle's influence. And so he is going to say, "I have read Aristotle and studied him with more understanding than did St. Thomas Aquinas or Duns Scotus." Luther never lacked for confidence in his abilities, but he ultimately concluded, "I cannot avoid believing that it was Satan himself who introduced the study of Aristotle." And Luther had a very kind of apocalyptic mindset. He saw Satan's activity everywhere, but Aristotle is one manifestation of that. Erasmus, another one of the reform-minded figures in the early 16th century, Erasmus says this. He says, "What has Christ to do with Aristotle? or the mysteries of eternal wisdom with subtle sophistry. And so he, like Tertullian, is saying, I think we've gone too far. He's going to talk about the philosophy of Christ, which is shed of all of these intellectual complexities. He would say, excluding the Platonists from their commentaries, they strangle the beauty of revelation. So he likes Plato more than he likes Aristotle. I think you could even say that Hamlet's famous statement, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy, is a dig at medieval Aristotelian scholasticism. I think it's when we look at the scientific revolution, though, that Plato is particularly significant. And I mentioned this earlier. I think this is really ironic because Aristotle is so fundamental to scientific thinking and to kind of an empirical approach to things. But by the 16th and 17th century, Aristotle's writings had become so associated with medieval scholasticism that when you read the writings of kind of practical scientific thinkers like Galileo, but even when you read the writings of some of the natural philosophers like Francis Bacon or Descartes, all of them have really negative things to say about Aristotle, or at least of their kind of caricatured version of Aristotle. And so it's going to be Plato who is going to be really fundamental here. Herman says, from the death of Copernicus in 1543 and Galileo's famous trial in 1633 until 1687, when Newton's Principia first came off the press, Europe saw a steady transformation from a view of nature built around Aristotle to a new Platonic understanding that hit the Aristotelian schoolmen like a wrecking ball, hitting a plate glass window. And when you look at Galileo's career, you see this really concretely as he is arguing against the Aristotelian and Ptolemaic assumptions of his day. One book, if you have not read this book, that I highly suggest is Dava Sobel's Galileo's Daughter. And I think Galileo is such an interesting character because the way that the story of Galileo is often told is this is really about a conflict between science and religion. Galileo represents science, the Catholic Church, reactionary, represents religion. And Sobel does a great job of showing that that's not how Galileo framed things at all. Galileo is devoutly Catholic. In fact, both of his daughters are Catholic nuns. And it's not just that he rejects the Ptolemaic Aristotelian assumptions of his day, but he actually says the theology, or not even the theology, I guess I should say the hermeneutics of the church are wrong because they have read the Bible through the lens of Aristotle. And so he's not going to say, my science is better than yours. He's actually going to say, my biblical exegesis is better than yours because I am reading Scripture without bringing all of these Aristotelian assumptions to bear. Galileo says of Aristotle's defenders, they wish never to raise their eyes from those pages of Aristotle as if this great book of the universe had been written to be read by nobody but Aristotle, and his eyes had been destined to see for all posterity. And I like that quote because I think it captures the reality, which is this is not really an attack on Aristotle. It is this over-dependence on Aristotle, this uncritical acceptance of Aristotle that Galileo is really calling into question. So Herman says this, Galileo's science managed to fuse the Platonist faith in mathematics with the Aristotelian faith in experience as the basis of discovery. All his works on mechanics, optics, and astronomy was deeply rooted in experiment and empirical research. And so, he does experiments with ramps and other things. Some of the scholarship on Galileo has actually called into question the extent to which some of the experiments he describes he actually did. Some of them may have been sort of mental experiments that he did. There's actually even debate about whether or not he dropped things off of the Tower of Pisa, although it's one of those stories, it's like the apple falling on Newton that's so good, you just have to tell it, even if it's not borne out by the evidence. But it says, when experience proved ambiguous or unreliable, Galileo realized then that mathematics must take over. The universe Galileo wrote is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, which sounds an awful lot like the Timaeus, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. And then Herman says, without mathematics, he concluded, one wanders about in a dark labyrinth, or what Plato might have called a cave. I think it's also interesting, around the same time in England, Francis Bacon is writing about the various idols that lead people astray. And one category he describes is the idols of the cave, which I think is a Platonic reference as well. The other thing about Galileo, it would have been one thing if Galileo had written all of his books in Latin for a learned audience, but he actually published his books in Italian in the vernacular. And another thing he has in common with Plato is Galileo wrote dialogues. And there's just something about the dialogue as a literary form that makes his ideas more engaging and more accessible. And so I think he appreciated that in the same way that Plato did. So we have Plato in the early church, Aristotle in the Middle Ages, kind of a Platonic resurgence in the early modern period. And then as we enter the 18th century and the period of the Enlightenment, Aristotle gets his time in the sun yet again. There's going to be kind of a backlash against Plato's ideas. And you see this in a variety of different ways. I think John Locke is a good example here, but we could find it in other places. So if you look at the Encyclopedia, which is one of the key works of the French Enlightenment, in the opening essay that introduces the Encyclopedia, the editors praise earlier thinkers, and people like Francis Bacon and John Locke are really key for them. But I think Locke is maybe the best example. Herman says, the Locke who inspired the 18th century was the philosopher who wired Aristotle's most important insight that all knowledge comes through experience into the modern Western mind. And Locke is not going to be an apologist for Aristotle in the same way that someone like Aquinas would be. In fact, I think he would probably share some of the prejudice about old ideas that other Enlightenment thinkers do. But when you look at Locke's writings, you see that his basic assumptions have a lot in common with Aristotle's. So in terms of epistemology, Locke writes an essay concerning human understanding in which he argues that all knowledge comes through experience and reflection, that we are this blank slate, this tabula rasa, very Aristotelian view of things. And then in his political writings, his two treatises on government, there, like Aristotle, he is going to argue for a view of the state which is more collaborative, a social contract between the citizens of the state rather than something that is top-down and more authoritarian in a Platonic sense. Again, I don't think he's drawing directly on Aristotle's politics, but I think he's drawing on currents that have been transmitted through Occam and Marsilius of Padua and others like that. In the 18th century, Locke's ideas, just like Aristotle's ideas, could be used to justify elements of the status quo that were problematic. And so just like Aristotle, Locke is going to defend the institution of slavery because slaves are a form of property. And so that's the conservative legacy of this period. You also see a reassessment of Plato. Plato's influence or his reputation is sort of falling as Aristotle's star rose. And so I got a couple of quotes to illustrate that. Voltaire, probably the most famous of the French philosophes, he says, "O Plato, you have done more harm than you know." And then I think this is probably my favorite, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson is reading Plato's Republic, and he lays it down. He said, "I laid it down often to ask myself how it could have been that the world should have so long consented to give reputation to such nonsense as this." So whatever the American Republic was, it was not a Platonic state. those Enlightenment ideas, I think the more Aristotelian tradition is going to be key there. Now, as we move on, late 18th into the 19th century, Plato's influence is still there. And you see that when you look at some of the major figures in this period, Plato, again, is right below the surface. Rousseau, who was a contemporary of Voltaire, a contemporary of Jefferson, and he contributed to the encyclopedia, but he was a little bit at odds with some of the Enlightenment assumptions. In retrospect, scholars are going to look back at Rousseau and call him the father of Romanticism. And Herman says almost everything that Rousseau wrote or thought after 1750 until his death in 1778 reflected one or more aspects of Plato's works. And I think this is sort of like the situation with Locke. It's not that Rousseau is reading Plato, but it's that those elements of the tradition are going to really resonate with him. And so in one of his early treatises, he writes this book called Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men. And this is a huge critique of private property and of capitalism. He's going to say basically all of the injustices in the world can be traced back to the moment that someone said, "This is mine." And so this is a very different attitude than Locke's defense of private property. And so I think you can see echoes in Rousseau on private property that go all the way back to the communism that's practiced by the guardians in Plato's Republic. In his political writings, he wrote The Social Contract. And he is going to emphasize that the interest of the community trumped the interest of the individual. He famously says at the beginning of the Social Contract that men are born free and are everywhere in chains. But most people, when they read the Social Contract, they have been drawn to his discussion of the general will. And he says at one point in the Social Contract, he says to be forced to submit to the general will is to be forced to be free. And I think there's a strong sort of Platonic element there. Plato doesn't use this language, but I think Plato would agree that to be forced to submit to the philosopher kings is actually to be more free than to be left to pursue your own ignorant, inclinations. Now, Rousseau, his writings are going to be read by the Founding Fathers. I mean, if you look at even like the Federalist Papers, the Founding Fathers do think government ought to embody in some sense the will of the people. But Rousseau also points in a more authoritarian way, and I think a lot of the authoritarian regimes, whether it is the Committee of Public Safety during the Terror, and certainly some of the communist regimes of the 20th century would say that they are embodiments of the general will. And you can basically justify anything if you are the embodiment of the general will. And so that is that more ominous aspect of Plato's political legacy. Plato, I think, is also lurking behind some of the other great thinkers of the 19th century. I didn't put this on the slide. Probably the most influential 19th century philosopher was Hegel, which is kind of interesting because almost no one reads Hegel anymore. But he was a looming and a towering figure. And Plato's understanding of history is almost like a secularized Neoplatonism. The spirit is sort of working itself out. And in fact, Herman says, it is a reshuffling of a worn-out Neoplatonist metaphysics cast as universal history. And like Plato, Hegel glorifies the state over the individual. In this case, the Prussian state, which is going to be the precursor of a unified Germany, and of course in the 20th century of even the Nazi regime. Hegel's writings are going to inspire, although he's going to be reacting to Hegel, the writings of Karl Marx. And in the Communist Manifesto in 1848, Marx proclaims that there is a specter haunting Europe, the specter of communism. And of course, any classically educated person is going to know that you can go back to the Republic, and you can see that form of communism there. Herman says, in truth, it was the specter of Book 8 of Plato's Republic. Those pages first spawn the idea of history as class struggle. And that definitely is a lens that Plato uses. Herman goes even further and says, false consciousness is the Marxist version of the cave, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, because Marx's whole idea is that what seems self-evident in a capitalist democratic society is actually not reality. People are trapped inside of this false consciousness, and he's trying to break them out of that. Now, that's going to look very different than Plato's philosopher escaping from the cave, but it's the same kind of dynamic that he is looking at. Now, in his book, Herman actually continues on into the 20th century. There's a really interesting chapter where he's talking about Einstein and theoretical physics and sort of the Platonic elements that go into that. He also talks about the impact of Plato and Aristotle on the United States. So I'll just read a quote which I think kind of captures this. So he says, America was Aristotle's offspring in more ways than one. Born in the age of Sir Francis Bacon, it grew under the double engines of commerce and slavery in the era of John Locke and achieved independence under the tutelage of the Enlightenment. But America was born under the shelter of Plato's legacy as well. From the moment the first pilgrims alighted at Plymouth Rock, it was the stepchild of the Reformation and became home to a peculiarly fervent evangelical Christianity. The utopian hope of making America a shining city on the hill and one nation under God, a historically grounded version of Augustine's heavenly city, has supplied as much drive and energy to America's development as its more practical Aristotelian side. So again, you can kind of see some of the dynamism of America is that it has both of these elements embedded in it.
Sorry, where was that quote from?
That's from Herman's book as well. Pages 514 to 516 in Herman's book. So here is how Herman kind of sums things up at the end of this sweeping intellectual history. He says, Plato became the godfather of the religious, artistic, intuitive, and mystical sides of the Western personality. Aristotle, in turn, became the spokesman for the West's utilitarian, scientific side. History shows that too much Plato brings a rigid dogmatism and an elitist arrogance, which easily slides into totalitarianism. Too much Aristotle, on the other hand, ends in the narrow-minded sterility in which everything is reduced to rote formula and habit and individual creativity is stamped out. A complacent behaviorist calculus begins to govern social and political relationships. So you need both of these forces. When we see one of them in the ascendant, we see Western society slipping into some of the potential downsides there. But I would say, I would agree with Herman in his final conclusion, which is, in their constant and fruitful tension, the thought of Plato and Aristotle provides much of the dynamism that has propelled the Western intellectual tradition. And so I think one of the things, and there are lots of other factors, obviously the presence of Christianity as a decisive factor in the West is key, but when you're comparing Western thought to the intellectual traditions in some other places, whether it is in ancient Hinduism or in Chinese thought, you don't have these dual pillars constantly battling with each other. And so I think that creative tension is something that accounts for a lot of both the coherence, but also the dynamism within that tradition. So this has been kind of an audacious attempt to summarize many centuries of Western intellectual thought. If you are interested in this, I would definitely encourage you to check out Herman's book, The Cave and the Light. It is interesting, as I was looking back, I was rereading it in preparation for this, and I looked at some book reviews of it. And actually, a lot of the book reviews were highly critical of the book, in part because they thought it was too reductionistic. And yet, as I was trying to think, well, how do I actually summarize Herman's analysis, you realize that it's hard to do because he's always qualifying. He's always saying, Plato, but, Aristotle, but, and obviously when you're trying to reduce it down, even to 550 pages, you're going to have to simplify some things. But I think he does a pretty good job of reflecting the complexity of the story as well. So in the time that we have left, I would love to just have kind of conversation about your thoughts about Plato and Aristotle's influence and how we might use Plato and Aristotle as a way of trying to get our students to wrestle with the Western intellectual tradition.
Question for you, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
24 centuries of the wrestling then by those of us living after they died. Would Aristotle have seen himself as an opponent of his master, or just taking it 10% further? I'm a friend of this, but let's...
Yeah, I mean, I think Aristotle's thought is different enough that he is consciously rejecting some of Plato's key assumptions. Although I think there is still, I mean, he is, one of my favorite intellectual histories is Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. And I think that what Plato and Aristotle share is a respect for, there is some transcendent truth and structure and meaning in the world. And that's what I was saying at the beginning. I mean, from a perspective of sort of postmodernism looking back, Plato and Aristotle have a lot in common with each other, despite their disagreements. But I think their differences are profound enough that Aristotle would say, I represent something different. Yeah.
How would Herman's idea of dynamism be different than something like the Hegelian dialectic? Because you could easily retool some of the conflict that he's trying to draw as the source of the Western intellectual tradition as just what Hegel is talking about.
Yeah, I think what separates them is that Hegel's dialectic is sort of an inevitable working out of the spirit, whereas what he's describing is this really messy process where all kinds of things, like even the fact that Boethius gets clubbed at a certain moment, or that the Turks sack Constantinople. And so I think he would say this is a highly contingent process that's playing out here. And there's nothing inevitable about this. And there's also, in Hegelian logic, each stage is a synthesis of everything that's come before. And this is not really a synthesis, right? They never really are ultimately reconciled. Mm-hmm. But I think you're right. I mean, I think he is trying to do what Hegel is trying to do, which is make sense of everything. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Was Luther's complaint with Aristotle about like the emphasis on virtue, whereas he was very much about faith and trying to get away from the Catholic Church's obligatory duty?
Yeah, I think that like most of the critics of Aristotle in the early modern period, Luther has a caricature of Aristotle in his mind. But I think you're right. When you look at when you look at Luther's debates with Erasmus, and sort of what separates the Renaissance and the Reformation is this sort of distinction between virtue versus faith. And so Luther and Erasmus write, Luther writes on the bondage of the will, Erasmus writes on the freedom of the will. And I think Erasmus, for all of his criticisms of medieval scholasticism, actually is closer to Aristotle's ethics, because he thinks that we are ultimately good and rational beings, whereas Luther has a much more pessimistic anthropology.
I was kind of curious about, with the early moderns, Da Vinci, what was it about Aristotle that they didn't like? I mean, as an empiricist, you would think that people kind of really branching into this new area of scientific investigation would really be enamored of, empiricism. But what is it about him they reject apart from?
I think it is dependence on Aristotle as an unquestionable authority. And so They don't think of him as an empiricist. They think of him as the authority that the church says, well, Aristotle says it, so it must be true. And that's...
Is it his link to scholasticism?
I think so, exactly. Yeah, so I think they see him exclusively through the lens of scholasticism. Whereas had Aristotle come back, I think he would have been like, no, I'm in your group. I'm in your camp. These people have done an injustice to my...
It was more of a fundamental misunderstanding.
I think so. And I think in every one of these cases, none of them, and we're incapable of fully projecting ourselves back into the original context when it was written. So they're reading Plato or Aristotle through their immediate concerns and misunderstanding them as much as they are understanding them. But I guess the lesson there would be that we are doing the same thing. So it's like we can't objectively assess them any better than people in the past might have done. I do like that Herman starts with the school of Athens, because I think that just having that tangible image is a really helpful way of saying, how do ideas, how do they relate to each other? And so just sort of mapping, there's some really interesting studies identifying all those individual people and who does Raphael place in each camp. And then also, of course, with that particular image, like all of the inside kind of jokes where Raphael has painted himself in, he's sort of peeking around, and you've got Plato as Leonardo da Vinci, and Bramante is in there. So, there's a lot of interesting dynamics that are going on there as well. Okay, well, I want to thank you guys for coming.